I'm James Chau. You're watching the Pacific Dialogue, where we bring you the United States and China unscripted. I'm thrilled this week to honor two people who have done so much through their work and through their lives to shape the world and humanity. Professor Ezra Vogel, who is the former director of the Fairbanks Center at Harvard University, and Professor Qingguo, Dean of International Studies at Peking University. You're over in Beijing and over in Boston. I'm in Hong Kong. But what about the world we live in today? Foreign Minister Wang Yi says that about 4 decades on from the China-United States forging this diplomatic relationship, they've now hit their lowest points. Qingguo, do you agree with what he says?
Well, it is at least one of the lowest points, depending on how you measure it. I think politically speaking, the relationship is at the lowest point. But if you talk about economic relations, social contacts, I think we are way ahead of that. So I think the political relationship is at the lowest point since then, yeah.
Professor Vogel, you've seen this relationship literally open and develop and evolve in its many beautiful and complex ways. Some people call it the lowest point. Jimmy Carter warned about a year and a half ago that they were heading towards a modern Cold War. Are these just words, or have they come now to full fruition?
I agree with Qingguo that politically we're perhaps at our lowest point. As you know, our Pompeo made a speech the other day that all of us who consider U.S.-China relations important thought was terrible. And the reaction has been very strong to that speech. And I think politically the discussions of coronavirus, where each country blames the other and the leaders blame the other country and probably say things that are not true, they exaggerate, is really very serious and very dangerous. And I agree that politically it's at the worst. And at the same time, we still have many contacts, even in the medical field. We have people in the two countries working together. We certainly have many businessmen working together, scholars working together. So it's not like it was in '73 when I first visited China, when there was almost no contact at all.
You talk about the pandemic, and of course, apart from the political cost, there's the cost of human lives. People are being infected, people are dying each and every day. We'll return to the pandemic, and perhaps also, if we may, to your early experiences in 1973. But Professor Vogel, your new piece in the Washington Post recalls many of the Chinese students that you've taught over many decades. You say that they're now being torn between a loyalty to their own country, a genuine loyalty, but also an affection for America, who many of them would see as their second home. Is it now impossible in a binary world to balance both interests, to be friends with both?
Well, they feel like I do, that I want to be patriotic to my own country, but I want to have good relations with the other country. And many of them who were here enjoyed the time here. And when Americans criticize without thinking, and they criticize every member of the Communist Party as if they were all the same, as if they all hated America, that's just not true. And for the many who were here and want to be patriotic to China, want to help their country, but want to maintain good relations with their friends and their studies, their fellow scholars and colleagues in the United States, they're put in a bind. And I think many of them that I know want to be patriotic. They want to help their country. Of course, they're proud of their country. But at the same time, they realize there are many good Americans, and even though American government policy now toward China is very nasty, and Trump and Pompeo say some crazy things, they know that many Americans are still ready to be good friends and work with them.
Well, Professor Vogel wrote this piece, as we said, in the Washington Post, which I'm sure Qingguo, you also saw as well. So, Professor Jia, what he says over there, what he writes in the headline about US policies pushing friends of China towards anti-American nationalism. I mean, how do you stop this from evolving further? You've seen in your own country, in Chengdu, an American consulate shut down just in the last day or two. We saw a couple of days before that, the Chinese consulate in Houston, after many years, a very important mission there, also shut down. How do you say stop? Pause. If we can't go forward, that's okay, but how do we pause and then stop the rot almost from seeping further into the soil?
Well, it's difficult. At the moment, I think the Trump administration appears to be determined to provoke some kind of a crisis in order to enhance his political position at home for re-election. So it's very difficult to stop it. And also, there is domestic politics in China too. So when the U.S. closes down the Houston consulate, China feels that it has to close down the Chengdu consulate. And if the U.S. decides to do something else, and Chinese government may feel necessary to do something else. So the relationship is still at a slippery slope, deteriorating. And I just hope that people on both sides would cool down and take a more pragmatic approach to handle the relationship. It's difficult, but I think people on both sides should make some efforts.
Professor Vogel.
There's some news in the United States I would like to tell you about that just the last 2 or 3 days that I think puts a new slant on things. And that after Pompeo's speech, the reaction in the United States was very virulently against it. And a lot of people who had not been speaking out are now speaking out. And in the last 3 days, in addition to my article in the Washington Post, there have been several prominent articles that are critical of Pompeo, much more than in the past. One was from the New York Times editorial page that came out yesterday. The whole editorial page was very critical of Pompeo, saying that, we can't go that far. We have to live in a world with China. We have to find a way to working with them. Secondly, there was an article in the National Interest by a man named Paul Heer, who was the National Intelligence Officer for Asia for 7 or 8 years. And he is very critical and goes into the details of what is wrong with the speech. And at CSIS, there was an article that just came out now that said that we were wrong to deal with Huawei in the way we did. It's in America's economic interest to keep open all those channels. And even our semiconductor industry needs to have sales to a lot of other countries in order to keep the preeminent position that it now has. So I sense in the United States now, just in the last 3 or 4 days, the Pompeo speech has aroused such an opposition that it makes me very hopeful. And of course, Trump will not change before the election. I'm afraid they will say a lot of things, and I'm afraid a lot of the Democratic candidates will also say a lot of things that are not good for promoting good China-U.S. relations. But I think that there is forming now a group of people who are much more expressive, who are beginning to say we've gone too far. That makes me much more hopeful that if we get a new president in January, that we can begin to try to pull the relationship back to a better one.
There are still obviously a few moving parts, and as you said, Professor Vogel, a few ifs still involved in all this, and there's a long way to go till the election, and even beyond that. But let's go back to you, Professor Jia, because you recently had a conversation with Chinophile. In that conversation, you described China's diplomacy as being consistent with the past. Does that necessarily indicate or infer that what has significantly changed in that time has been the United States' approach to its relationship with Beijing, or is that in itself an oversimplification?
Well, what I meant is that China's the substantive aspects of Chinese foreign policy have not changed very much. China still wants to have a peaceful international environment for domestic reforms and economic development. And China still adheres to the sovereignty principle against foreign intervention. So in substance, China's foreign policy has not changed that much. But in style and in posturing, it has changed a great deal. It's more proactive in doing things. And that, in a way, get a lot of people having the idea that China's foreign policy has changed. I think at the substantive level, the change is not that significant. But of course, China has risen with greater capabilities. So many of the things that previously were viewed with less importance, now people attach a lot of importance to it. So we have a different situation.
Well, as the outsider here in this conversation, it's been very sad to see the different approach to the world. China has engaged with the world in more ways than it has in the last decades, sometimes in ways that are perceived as a threat to democracy and traditional Western powers. The United States has been pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, out of the Paris Agreement, out of the United Nations within parts of it. And Ezra Vogel, you talk about the Fulbright program. You say our Americans sent to China by the Fulbright program have done a marvelous job at establishing academic relationships and making important connections. That's now under threat as well. But I want to speak to a broader issue on education, because many students and many of your own students will be worried about where they're going to become the fall, not only Chinese students, but foreign students, international students as a whole, and of course, American students who don't know whether they should be packing their bags and going back to school in a couple of weeks' time. I mean, what do you tell them? Because this situation is still very fluid. We're speaking on July 28th. There have been some chop and changes in the last couple of days as well. What do you tell your students?
Well, first of all, I don't have students now because I've graduated and have retired. But I tell my friends who are students that it is a very fluid situation. The coronavirus, even without the foreign student situation, is very uncertain. And whether we will have classes where students will actually assemble and be together, whether small classes will meet or large classes will meet, or whether everything will be done by Zoom, even those things are very uncertain. So then the question of the foreign student becomes very complicated. Or you take even American students who are abroad now. Can they come home? Or can they carry on their education by Zoom? All these things are very much up in the air and it's very uncertain. What I tell my students is that even though our country has taken a very bad policy, that our educators have fortunately been very united. And immediately the presidents of Harvard and MIT immediately tried to figure out a way to stop the effort to make it more difficult for foreign students to come. And they had very strong support from American universities. Part of it is financial, of course. The Chinese students pay a lot of tuition and are very helpful. A lot of them are very important for research laboratories. But a lot of it is because we believe in international education. We think it's good for our country to welcome students from all over the world. They have free discussions about all kinds of issues, and that we want to take a welcoming position. And we think it's good for our country. We think it's good for the world. So I think what I want to do when I talk to students from China is to reassure them that even though there are some crazy people in the government and there are some crazy individuals at universities, that overwhelmingly the American people are welcoming and want to make our universities attractive for Chinese students.
Professor Jia, let's find out what's going on in Beijing, where you are. As we said, you're the Dean of International Studies at Peking University, one of the world's leading educational institutions. The pandemic is not a United States problem, it's a humankind problem, and it impacts the Chinese people very deeply as well. There are cases resurging over in China. There is no guarantee, and there's every likelihood that this is going to reoccur in the next weeks or months, as it has done all around the world. I mean, where are your students at right now, even if they're not traveling abroad, even if they're staying at home in China?
Well, during the last semester, most our students basically stayed at home. They take classes online, and they even took thesis defense online. So a lot of work was done online. But probably next semester, if the situation improves, then we can have face-to-face classes. But it's a challenging time. We don't know when the coronavirus problem will be resolved. We are hoping that a vaccine would come out, but it will take some time. But China's situation has improved a lot. But then we are surrounded in the world of pandemics going on. And also there are sporadic outbreaks of coronavirus pandemic in China in different places during the past months. So life is still difficult, but it's improving here. And with regard to the exchanges, I think we are doing I think we are going to do something online as well. Every year we send a lot of students overseas to study. Some on a long-term basis, others on a short-term basis, like 6 months to a year. But then I think in the next year, I think probably some students would have to take online classes rather than going physically to the countries they are supposed to.
So I was going to ask you whether educational exchanges, which are this great backbone of the US-China relationship, whether they're going to become a thing of the past or become less of a factor in the relationship. But do you say then, therefore, Qingguo, that online exchanges may replace or may make up for some of the physical exchanges that we're limited by because we can't travel, because we are still waiting for a vaccine and other public health measures to contain our own outbreaks?
Well, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think this is the most efficient way for us to continue exchanges. But I think after that, we still need to send students overseas and receive overseas students to have an in-person relationship. I think that relationship is very, very important. I myself is a product of this kind of exchange. I went to the US in 1981 and I did my PhD there. I forged great friendships with a lot of people there. And I think I understand the US much better just because I was physically there. If I was just taking courses online, probably I wouldn't get the same kind of level of understanding. So I think in person exchanges are very, very important. I hope that the current U.S. policy of discouraging foreign students, especially students from China, would change in the days to come. And I believe that it is in the best interest of our two great countries for us to carry on that kind of exchange.
Well, you were both in each other's countries at seminal points in their history. Professor Vogel, you mentioned it was 1973, in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, when you first visited China, just a year after Richard Nixon went on that historic visit to Beijing. What was China like in 1973?
It was extremely poor. It was very closed. People were afraid to talk with Americans. There were almost no cars. And everything was very carefully scripted. And yet I could feel among the Chinese academics that we met that there was an eagerness and a hope to get exchanges started. There were a few people in 73 who had, like Zhou Peiyuan at Peking University, who had been in the United States in the 1930s and who still had contacts. And one could just sense their eagerness of wanting to get something started. And we felt the same way in the United States, that a small number of our delegation from the National Academy of Sciences have had contacts with some Chinese scholars. And so they're very eager to resume them, the contacts. And it's very good for international science, it's very good for friendship, but it was unfortunately not to be. I mean, some of them had hoped that by 73, things would really begin to open up. But it turned out that it wasn't until after the third plenary in 1978 that relations really began to open up, exchanges really began to blossom. But one could just sense that to many people who had had those opportunities to study in the other country, knew each other, it was good for everyone.
Well, 1978, as you said, was when China opened up and when it began its reforms. And very soon after that, Qingguo, you first went to the United States to study, which means that you would have been one of the very first Chinese students to go to America after the competitive examinations had restarted after a decade of absolute chaos in mainland China. I mean, what did you find when you landed at the airport? And which airport did you arrive at? Which city?
New York, Kennedy Airport. Yeah, that was an experience. I was there. I did not know what I was going to face because no Chinese students have been there before me after the founding of the PRC in 49. So there was no example of Chinese students graduating from US universities. So I was very much scared in a way. But it was a very interesting experience. Yeah, people were very nice to me. And also, I think the study opened my eyes. I found we are people sharing a lot of common interests in curiosity, in a lot of things. So it was a good experience. Yeah. Of course, at that time, physically, the living, in terms of living standard, the U.S. Situation was much better. Housing, food, almost everything. But China has caught up in many ways since then. But I think as human beings, we still share a lot of things in common. And those things have not changed.
The reason why I ask you both about your earliest experiences is because this, for you, I know, is not an academic discussion. This is a relationship that impacts yourselves, your families, your friends, and your students, and all them together. So it's an emotional point of discussion as well. You talked, Ezra Vogel, about 1978, and Qingguo has elaborated on that as well. That was a period when there was so much richness in the technology and science relationship that they shared. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter, pushing China to elevate itself on those fronts as well. Yet now, a couple of decades later, and a couple of decades is not a very long time, we have Huawei, we have TikTok emerging as the pillars of contention, almost as the weapons, the sticks by which one side or the other side may be wielding. What happens now? Because obviously it creates a very delicate balance between the pragmatism of economics, but also the delicacy of security. What happens now? What are some of the decision-making processes that would have happened here?
Well, speaking for the United States, I think we have to admit that there are a lot of problems in the United States that we have not handled well. And we have not handled the problem of equality well. And there are some people who are very rich, but there are many people who have been displaced because they were industrial workers and don't have a place to work. And we haven't found good jobs for them that give them confidence and income and self-respect. And when we have competition coming from the outside, it's very scary. And for some people, they want to blame China for interfering and taking our jobs away. Some of them feel that Chinese have stolen our technology. They feel that we've worked so hard to invent things. It takes a lot of time to develop a new idea, a new technology. And sometimes the Chinese have learned about it by open study, which we cannot really complain about. We have to admire it. But sometimes some Chinese have done so surreptitiously and not following rules. And so those cases become the focus of people who are upset about other things, about losing their jobs or inequality. And I think that to improve our relations with China over the next decade or two, we need to work on solving our own problems too. We need to have a fair distribution of income. We need to have medical care that covers the entire population. We need to have a school system that provides opportunities for people at the bottom of the ranks as well as at the top. So we have a lot of homework on our own side. And we Americans also feel that China needs to be more careful about respecting intellectual property, that needs to show proper appreciation. And we're very worried now that some new Chinese electronic equipment might get secret information, since we see that the Huawei machinery is used in China to follow what other people are doing. Some of our people who are worried about their human rights and protection are afraid that that could be used secretly. So there are a lot of issues that we Americans need to work on, and need to work on with the Chinese in order to relieve the tensions.
Professor Chau, you've heard about the American homework, as Professor Vogel has described it, that they need to get on with. But do you think as a first step, and I know there may not be any agreement on whether some of the activity has been surreptitious or whether some of the technology is a threat, but let's just start off with a basic point here. Do you think that the Chinese, or China as a whole in the broad sense, could begin to heal and apply some of that healing balm to the relationship by perhaps sharing more? I mean, they talk very much about a community of nations. Do you think it needs to share more? And if it is already sharing more, should it make a bigger show of it as an olive branch?
Well, I think there are many reasons for the current problems. I think the U.S. Many Americans are suspicious of what China does, in part because they subscribe to different assumptions. One is the realist assumption that when a great power arises, it would expand. It would challenge the established power, the so-called Thucydides trap. And of course, others subscribe to the argument that U.S. policy is to change China into a liberal democracy like the U.S. And they are very disappointed that China has not changed according to their expectations. And the Trump administration, of course, has contributed to the poisoning the atmosphere further by arguing that China is the enemy, is the rival, China is the theft, is the criminal, is the country that does not follow laws, is aggressor, that sort of thing. And so now I think a lot of people in the US have little trust in China. That's the problem underlining this 5G or high-tech problems. Okay, basically, as Tom Friedman would argue that during the 5G period, countries in relationship requires some level of trust because of the internet, because of the high speed of information transmission. So you need some kind of a trust in order to conduct relationship. And basically, I think the two countries is suffering from a trust deficit. As a result, the Trump administration can push for this technological decoupling policy with China. What China can do is, of course, try to repair, to do a better job of explaining whatever it does, ranging from South China Sea to Xinjiang to Hong Kong. I don't think China has done a good job in explaining its actions, why it does this and what the situation are, and invite people to see what's going on in those places. This is one thing that China can do. Another thing that China can do is, Huawei has offered to open its source for some of its software. And so in this way, it tries to make sure that other people are not worried about whatever things they may put into the software. So basically, on the technological front, I think we should have more exchanges, also to assure each other. I think Americans also have a responsibility to assure China that Microsoft, Google are not going to undermine China's so-called national security. So both sides have to make a lot of efforts in this regard to rebuild some level of the trust for the relationship to continue. But at the moment, I think the Trump administration, I don't have much faith in the Trump administration in doing it. I'm looking forward to the next administration to do it.
You use the word trust. It reminds me of a new survey finding that came out, I think, in the last couple of hours. a survey conducted by Edelman that says 95% of Chinese have trust in their government. And I bring this up because we live in a time of a global pandemic when trust in political leadership is, of course, very important. But while that may differ in the United States and China, we can certainly agree that we live in a world of many moving parts. Mistrust in our governments and institutions. We're in a permanent state now of mourning and a permanent state of unfamiliarity as we look ahead. But these two countries are without a doubt, no matter what happens between them, the most important relationship in the world today. I need to finish by asking you a question that I'm sure many ask you. What do you think is going to happen next? With or without the elections, if we remove that factor, what do you see happening, Professor Vogel?
Well, I think it will depend partly on the election, because I think under the Trump administration, we cannot expect much improvement. People are making very crazy statements, and it's not a well-organized administration that values diplomacy and has long-term strategy. So I think the best hope is, on our side, is that by January, that we begin to have working groups on the two sides that meet together and talk about how do we develop trust. Some of the things that Americans are most concerned about are, is the Chinese market really fair to American companies? And I think many of them have complaints about how their products were used and taken away, and how the Chinese government favors Chinese firms and not American firms. And when China was weak, it didn't matter that much. But now Chinese firms are strong, and the Chinese are very competitive. So that becomes a very big issue. I think we're also very concerned in places like the South China Seas, where Chinese airplanes and ships begin to move. And that creates very great doubts about what Chinese intentions are, and it makes the trust all the more difficult. So I think, in short, that in January, assuming we get a new administration, we can begin to have meetings. And there are a lot of people on both sides who are perfectly capable of carrying on those discussions if they have the full support of their top leaders. And I think the top leaders have to be involved in the process of building trust and getting better relations. But I'm hoping that we can begin to do that, and that in areas like dealing with coronavirus and dealing with international warming, that we can begin to develop some cooperative projects that will then expand into security areas, so that we can begin to rebuild some of the trust. I think we're going to be rivals, but ball teams are very big rivals, but they operate in a framework, and I think that's what we need now. We need a framework to contain the rivalry so that we can work together and have friendly relations that are really in both our benefits.
Qingguo, I have to push you over here. You yourself have said that China perhaps needs to be better at communicating, better at conveying in the future. What's the story going to look like? You've got a story where Xinjiang is a concern, Tibet keeps coming up, Hong Kong is this new subject where I am, and then of course you've got an app that millions of teenagers around the world use to dance to and record themselves on their mobile phones, but it's now one of the big stories in this relationship between the United States and China. Add to that a phase 2 trade deal, the South China Sea. What do you see for all of us?
Well, I think I agree that in the next few months, this relationship cannot improve. Maybe when the next administration comes in, we'll have opportunities to improve the relationship. but that doesn't mean that our problems are going away. Our problems are not going away, and we have to be realistic and pragmatic in handling them. I think China should do a better job in terms of becoming more transparent, in terms of explaining its actions, its behavior more clearly to others, and also invite others to come to see in their own eyes what the situation are. China has been saying that, oh no, what you say is wrong, it's total rubbish, but you need to establish what you say is right. Okay, and in that aspect, I think China has a lot of homework to do. And also, I believe that that China should continue deepen its reforms, especially our SOEs, to create more level field for market competition. Okay. A lot of people say that we're going to have a competitive relationship or rivalry. I think I'm not against rivalry or competition, but I do think that we need to have a benign competition. I think benign competition is good for both countries and also for the world. Okay? China probably can learn a lot from the US where it does well, and US can learn a lot from China when it does well. For example, China has been doing well in terms of building its infrastructure, and the US can learn something from China. The US has done a good job in terms of having a better protection of individual rights. I think China has a lot to learn in that regard. So if we can do a better job as for the other to learn, then we are making a contribution to the other side and also to the world. I think this kind of rivalry or competition is very much welcome by the rest of the world and by people of all countries.
Well, that's exactly it. May I just say that the homework is not just for Chinese and Americans, but people from all countries of my generation and those who are using TikTok right now, because this is clearly a dynamic, a relationship that impacts everybody. And I'm so grateful to both of you for opening your minds and allowing us in so we can understand why it matters to all of us, no matter where we are on the planet today. Professor Ezra Vogel, Professor Qingguo, thank you very much. Be well, be safe, and take care in this pandemic as well.
Thank you
very much.